Good afternoon. This is Cann speaking. I'm sorry I'm not able to be with you at this time. I'm looking forward to sharing some time with you, though, this winter term. I have 4 art history classes that I'll be presenting: Alfred Beardsley, Japonisme, Mary Cassatt, and the Value Tapestry. Now, Aubrey Beardsley was an interesting fellow. He was very young. He died at the age of 25. He was a British artist. And in that short period of time, he started life as an insurance clerk in London. And by the time he was done, he was the leading illustrator on the art scene. He got mixed up with Oscar Wilde publicly through providing illustrations for Salome, which was a play that Wilde had written first in French, and then in translation, Beardsley did the illustrations for it. When Wilde was convicted of sodomy, Beardsley's career nearly vanished in the aftermath. His work established the Art Nouveau movement, and it is still well appreciated today, even though it can be a bit risque, and that's something to keep in mind if you are attending the class. His work is elegant, beautiful, but it's kind of on the edge of what some people consider acceptable. Here's a sample of his work. It's elegant, but erotic, and there'll only be one session. Most of my classes will be divided into 2, but this is a single session. It'll cover the 7 years when he was active as an illustrator before tuberculosis consumption ended his life. He played himself up as a personality, so he wasn't simply an artist, he was something more, and that attracted, of course, more audience to his work. The next class I'll be presenting is the Value Tapestry. It was completed within a couple of years of the narrative that it portrays. In 1066, when William the Bastard, a Norman duke, crossed the North Sea and English Channel, invaded England, conquered, killing Harold, the king at that time, and becoming the new king of England, known as William the Conqueror. It's called a tapestry, but it's actually an embroidery. It is very, very long, but narrow, and it tells a fascinating story, and it's kind of like a cartoon strip in a way. And so it's very animated, very vivid in the colors, surprisingly so when you consider that it's 1,000 years old, pretty much. And it will be a repeat for me. I presented it to the Charleston community a year ago when we still had in-person classes. And at that point, it was a single session. I have divided it into 2 segments. And the part 1 will cover the history related to the tapestry, the tale at the beginning, told through Harold interacting with the King Edward, then on to his betrayal of William and being crowned King of England. The classes are in February. The first part will be on the 8th. The second part will be on the 15th. They run in the early afternoon from 12:30 to 2 on Mondays. So the second part of the tapestry will cover the Battle of Hastings itself, all the things that happen in it, related battles, the history that is encapsulated within it. It ends with the coronation of William as the new King of England. And this is part 2, and it will be on February 15th. The third class I'll be offering, Japonisme, West meets East. That was a French term that was coined in the 1800s for all things Japanese. imports burst upon the scene in Europe following Commodore Perry, the American Commodore, reopening the ports of Japan forcibly to the rest of the world. For 250 years, under a shogunate, Japan had been closed to the outside world, self-imposed isolation. And in the process, all of the culture and art focused inward instead of outward, and developed new styles, new content, new art elements, composition, the visions that were being presented. And coming out of this period of isolation, these new products burst forth onto the art scene in Europe as arrived the furniture, the fabric, the costumes, and most importantly, these cheap little prints that were long runs of woodblock prints that had been produced in the Edo, what is now Tokyo region of Japan. And they had been originally done basically like little flyers to encourage people to go to events or participate in activities or just support activities within this small complex. But the artists themselves created really beautiful things. And these cheap flyers arrive in Europe and are simply overtaken by the artists. They so welcome this new perspective on how art can be produced, what it can do, the message it can bring to the public. And most artists from that time were affected one way or another, some directly copying or incorporating what they saw into their arts, others changing the way they created their art, whether it was composition, color choices, the elements that were involved, the directionality, and all of that had an enormous effect on the art scene. And as the result, most Impressionist artists and post-Impressionist artists had a pivotal moment, and after which their art had a different look. Two of the artists involved were both Beardsley and Cassatt, and because of that, something that I had known about but never really followed through changed my own perspective on what I should be presenting. So this class was an outgrowth of my research on the other two artists. Part one of the Japanisme class will be covering the artwork of the Japanese masters of this woodblock technique. Now, I do not speak Japanese, so I will probably do a very bad job speaking the names of these artists or even their technique, ukiyo-e. Ukiyo-e. So part one will be the ukiyo-e artists, and many of you will probably recognize this, the Great Wave. It was by Hokusai, one of those artists, and this was just one of a series of prints he did basically on Mount Fuji, which is seen there in the background. And among the many artists who were affected was James Abbott McNeill Whistler, and here you see Whistler's mother. And that painting was done after he began to adapt some of the elements of the Japanese woodblocks art styles. So in part two, we'll be focusing on the Western artists who changed their styles to a certain extent based on this new art that they were exposed to. And finally, we'll be looking through my Women Artists series at Mary Cassatt. Now, she was an American, but she moved to Paris to participate in the Impressionist movement in the 18th century. Her best friend was Edgar Degas. Many of you are familiar with Degas' work. And Mary Cassatt joined the movement, developed her own style, which was within the purview of the overall Impressionist movement. But her focus was on domestic topics. being a woman in the Victorian period, which this still was, she was not involved in some of the topics that were popular with some of the male artists from the movement, whether they were dance hall scenes or boudoir scenes. She chose instead to focus on children, young women, and mothers with their children. They were very well received at the time and are still very popular today. So using Mary Cassatt as my focus, I will also touch on some of the other artists involved with her, but we will look at her, which was, she had a very long life and her art styles changed over time. But in part one, which is scheduled for the 5th of March in the morning, we will go through her early years, her breakthrough into Impressionism, and her support of feminism. And in part two, we will look at her relationship with Degas, her prints that moved into this new style, the Japonisme style, and her later life. Unfortunately, like Degas, in her final years, cataracts created the situation where she was slowly going blind. But since it was in her 90s, she had already produced a great deal of wonderful work that you'll have the opportunity to see. So I look forward to seeing you in all 4 classes: Alfred Beardsley, the Value Tapestry, Japonisme, and Mary Cassatt. Hope to see you this winter term at some of these classes. So have a great day. I'm sorry I couldn't be there in person, but I hope this helps communicate to you some of the classes available and it encourages you to join in. Thank you. So let's close this.